We're going to move on to the next part of our agenda. We have Charlene Bearhead. She's a mother, grandmother, experienced educator, and education innovator with 30 years of regional, national, and international experience. She currently serves as the education coordinator for the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, volunteers as a co-chair of the Downey Wenjack Fund Board of Directors, and is a member of the Pathways to Education Canada Indigenous Education Advisory Circle. She also works to support the Alberta School Boards Association and College of Alberta School Superintendents for the Alberta Joint Commitment to Action, Education for Reconciliation. Charlene most recently served as the first education lead for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. Prior to that, she was the national coordinator for Project of Heart and for the National Day of Healing and Reconciliation. Charlene has served as a teacher, principal, education director, and superintendent, both on and off reserve, over the years and holds a permanent teaching certificates from both Alberta and Manitoba. Please welcome Charlene Bearhead.
Aborstit, Opabin Shawia, Imigebi, Shnisha Dewa Kai, Shnish Mina Makuche, Shnish Wichashda Iska, and Shnish Pinamat Sykes for not only the beautiful prayers that you offered last night and today, but also for sharing more words with us today. Shnish. And it's always good to be, although I'm a visitor here from Treaty 6 territory, just a little bit north, it's always nice to still be in Nakota territory and hear the language of my husband and our extended family as well, so Ishnish. And it's also good to get a chance to be again with my good friend Marie Wilson. We've done different parts of, I've done a very, a tiny part, so I loved it when she showed the video of the students, because it takes me back to when we were there in the middle of those 5,000 students, and every time I see the beginning of that video where that guy's holding the L, where he's holding the L, and I think people look at that, look at those kids. All I think is, remember that when we were going to have 1,600 kids and it was September and the school year started, and 8 days before the event, we had 5,000 kids signed up. And a person who was responsible for collecting that information in the Ottawa office of the TRC, when I called her and said, we have a little issue. She goes, oh dear, what's that? And I said, well, we're going to need another workshop. And she said, oh, okay. I said, for about 2,500 kids. She said, can I call you back? But the reason that is a really important piece to me and a good reminder is there isn't the plan. When Del and I first talked about what would this presentation be, what would the topic be, and talked about from truth to reconciliation as we're on that journey, and we know that that's a journey that is just a journey and then another journey and an ongoing journey, and that really the destination, I'm not sure that we're ever going to see that, and I don't know that we hope to see an end, because as Marie shared, the relationship is what's important, and I think that as people start to move into that, we realize how much deeper that needs to go, and then how much deeper that needs to go. And so I want to invite you to think about how flexible we need to be in that, how open we need to be, how we need to be watching and looking and hearing and feeling the energy that's around us. And sometimes it's not a good feeling. Sometimes we need to pray really hard for ourselves. And as one of my colleagues says, sometimes I like to pray for people. I like to pray for them really, really hard. And so I took a stress ball today. And I was talking with one of the staff members from the BC office, and we talked about how that's a healthy way to channel our energy, because we know that if we, in our work, as frustrating and difficult as it can be sometimes, and as rewarding as it can be sometimes, that there is nothing to be gained by expressing the frustration in an angry or aggressive way to people. So our challenge, and it's always my challenge, so I may be projecting this onto the rest of you, is to think about how do we always do that in a good way so that we continue to invite people to that journey, to this journey that we're onto this path of reconciliation and moving from truth. And when we were driving down yesterday, Marie and I were talking about, the parts of what we were presenting on, and we talked about how many times Marie, Willie, Justice Sinclair are still presenting the truth, and how important it is, and she said that again today, that there are still so many people, the majority of people who still need to hear that truth. And so I think that as we get to those different places along that journey from truth to reconciliation, we need to really think about ourselves and who we are. And when I talk to teachers often, and we have to remember that education, and Corey and I are going to be talking about education this afternoon, but in the context of truth and reconciliation, education really isn't contained to kindergarten to grade 12 and post-secondary institutions, but it's every Canadian in every walk of life, in every area. So education is broad, and I was teaching, working with a group of students, teaching and sharing with them a grade 6 class just last week. Actually, it was this week, I guess it was Monday, and reminded them that they really are the ones who are so far ahead right now in education and of their responsibility, but their power to change things, because they're more educated than most of the adults in this country by virtue of the time of Truth and Reconciliation and post-Truth and Reconciliation Commission that they are living and learning and growing. So, of course, the calls to action, and I love that Anne-Marie gets to say this as one of the commissioners. You have to read that. I remind people that I'm constantly nagging about they're not recommendations and all the reasons why they're calls to action. I remember us having that discussion as you were working through that with the commissioners, because recommendations are optional. And this cannot be, this movement from truth that the survivors and the commission had the courage and the strength and the persistence to bring forward in this country. We don't get to stop there. But as we move along that path, it's so important that each of us think about what our own role is in that. And that 94 is a lot of calls to action. But that there's nothing optional about this. There's nothing optional about us moving forward. It's difficult. Sometimes the things that make it most difficult are the reminders to us about why we really can't let up. And so I'll be honest, I often say to people, when you're reading the calls to action, please don't scan it, and if it doesn't say, Martha, we call upon you, you're out. Because the commissioners, I think, did an incredible job of not only sequencing, and it was not lost on many of us, what the first 5 calls to action focus on, and then, of course, 6 to 12 for education as well. I think it was critically important to call upon the people who should, who need to, who have responsibilities, but it's incumbent upon every one of us to find ourselves within there. I talk to people about finding yourself between the lines. So what I would like to have us think about is you calling yourself to action. I can't call you to action because I don't know you. The commissioners could call broadly and very specifically people in all walks of life in this country to action, but the glue that'll hold that together, that'll continue to make that move, will be what you call upon yourself for. And so I think that when I think about that path from truth to reconciliation, I think it's important to remember that it's not a straight line. It's not the same path for everyone. And I'm not going to say the destination, because I remind people when I'm working, people want to do, especially in education, I don't know if it's in other fields, I'm going to say probably. People say, so let's work our way backwards. Where do we want to get to? And then how do we get there? So I think it's important for us to remember we don't know where we need to get to because we are so far from it that we haven't even seen it yet. But if we can think about where do we get to next, and we're moving the right direction down that path, when we get to that next place, and it needs to be, a place that requires courage and action. And I really appreciated Marie, when you talked about how it's not status quo, but I really liked how you clarified what that was. Because sometimes people will say, well, it's not exactly the same, but that it is not just a different version of what is currently happening and what has happened. So I think that as we think about what that next step is, and I want to invite you because that's what this part of our time together is about. And it's not new for any of you. I'm going to say that there's not a person in this room that hasn't thought about it, that isn't doing some work in your office, in your life, with your families, in your community. I'm going to say that this is not going to be the first step for you. But I'm going to ask you to think about where you were at the time of the release of the final report, when you first saw the calls to action, or when maybe you weren't there, but when it was introduced and this work was introduced to you in the work that you're in now, in your families and communities. Think about where you were then and think about where you are now in that work. And so on the days when you feel like you're not making any progress, and we're asking each other, are we really making a difference? Are we really making any changes? Are we seeing changes? I think sometimes it's helpful to think about that period of time and 2 years out now, and take that as a beginning and a next step, but also then thinking about knowing now what you know, experiencing now what you've experienced, having the relationships and the connections that you've built as a result of being called to action, as a result of you being there, of that commitment that was made. And how does that continue to change and evolve? And it's also not a direct flight. Has anybody noticed that it's not the non-stop route? I think, I'm not sure about the rest of you, but it's certainly been my experience with the different groups and organizations that I've had the honor of working with, again, mostly in education, but sometimes with judges, sometimes with people in the field of healthcare. But in this work of education, of broader education, and engaging people and engaging with people and helping people to engage with the Indigenous people of the territory where they live and work and learn. And so as we think about being, 2 years out now from the final report and the calls to action, people for the most part, and I mean, let's be honest, I always think that, and maybe this is just wishful thinking, but I think this is true, that the majority of people are good. And the majority of people have a good heart and have good intentions and are kind. It's just that the negative ones are so loud. You notice that? They always come across as though they're the majority, and they're not. And so we have to have the courage, and sometimes the emotion, especially in all of this, the emotion can really drive that. I was talking to my good friend Laura this morning about how I'm so impressed and I'm aspiring to be a little more like her. And come on, she's Mohawk and she's calm. So I need to just do better. And and it's not about compromising the strength and the passion and the commitment that she has. But some days when I watch her field some things that would just about put you over the edge, and I say to her, you're my role model in that one. But we get to these places, and I think in the beginning there are important, we have to start with people where they're at. That is just the reality. Otherwise, we're going to overwhelm people. And there will be lots of emotion, and I really appreciated the courage from Sykes this morning to come up and share that and talk about that emotion. And when Marie showed the video clip with the kids, I used that a lot in education, and I actually started keeping track, so I thought, surely I'm going to get to that place. It was the 16th time that I shared it that I didn't cry. And I have a lot of teachers ask me, or people, and sometimes, as I said, sometimes it's judges, and you're going, whoa, you hold the lives of Indigenous people in your hands, and you don't know this. But I don't say that. I say, I'm so glad that you're here, and so glad that you're asking those questions. But for the most part, I think that people want to do something better. They want to do something that's good. And often people will say to me, okay, I get it now. I need to get to know the people of the territory. I have a role. Because I don't know if you hear this, but often I hear, well, I don't have the right to do this because I'm non-Indigenous. Or I'm so ashamed to be white. My response is usually, okay, if that's what you need to do, then I don't get to tell you that's not helpful. But I don't see any action in being ashamed to be white or re-traumatizing Indigenous people. Those are two things that are not helpful. But we do need to acknowledge truth. And when people ask, okay, I understand my role in this now, because my thought that I'd like to share with people is we all have a responsibility to speak truth. We all have a responsibility to teach truth. We all have a responsibility to firmly, but with love, sometimes tough love, correct the things that we hear that are very inaccurate. So when people understand their role in that and they see themselves between those lines of the calls to action or in this work, regardless of what their heritage is or their culture or their language or their background, when people understand every one of us has a role and responsibility in this work together. Sometimes the question is, how do I do this without crying? Do you hear that? I hear that a lot. How do I do this without crying? I have to be honest with people and say, if you figure that out, could you come and tell me? But the other thing that I share is whether you're a person who cries or not, if you can be involved in this, if you can hear the stories, if you can see the suffering and the hurt in families and it doesn't break your heart, I think that's when you need to seek help. I don't worry too much about the crying. I think that's the way we're taught, is that that's the healing. But what I do see often as we're moving, further down this path, and I like to remind people, this cannot be the orange shag carpet of the 80s. We can't be saying in 15 or 20 years, remember when reconciliation was a thing? Remember when that was so important? We can't do that. That would be to dishonor the courage of the survivors, the hard work of the commission, and the hope that the children have, and the hope that the children have, and the faith that they have in us, to hear them, to listen to them. I mean, some of my biggest heroes in this country are the kids at Feathers of Hope. They're amazing. They're powerful. And the reason I believe, I forgot to mention I don't know anything. I only believe things and think things, and I'm a person with one lived experience. But what I believe is so powerful behind that movement is that it's not about the adults that are supporting it. It's about the young people, and it just doesn't say on paper that they're driving it. They are driving it. And if any of you have seen that and had the honor of being in their presence, that is lived in that work. And so I think that those are really important resources around us, the young people and the elders. We're always taught that the older someone is and the younger someone is, the closer they are to the Creator. And so they bring that strength and that power and in a good and honest way. But as we move a little bit further down that path, I think to start with, people were excited. People were excited to find and understand and realize, oh, I really do have a place in this. I really do have a role in this. There is something important. And if I ask the people who are the people of the territory where I live and work and learn. And if we work together, then I'll know what that is and it'll be even clearer and we'll be more powerful together. So people can really handle things like territory acknowledgements. That's a really important start, but it's a start. People can really handle things like putting up the Treaty 7 flag or the Treaty 6 flag outside schools. That's a really important place to start. About finding out whose traditional territory they live in, they work in, who some of the elders are. But I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm really seeing a lot of this and having a lot of colleagues around the country step up to say, okay, we're starting to get some pushback. Even the people who were very excited in the beginning are now saying, okay, we've done that. Okay, that's enough now. We've done that. We've done the Indigenous stuff, or we know. I think, oh, that's so, you don't even know that you don't even know. We have a huge, huge beginning as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But it's about what do we do with that? And Marie said it again today. What do we do with that, not because it's our job, but because we live here? And our jobs and our work give us that extra opportunity. And yes, it's a responsibility, but because of the work that we're all in and our different parts in that, it gives us the opportunity to be able to amplify in a big way what it is that we know and believe that we need to do and are doing in our own reflection on ourselves, our families, our communities. And that's a huge gift, and it is a huge responsibility, because the children can only hope. That's all they have, is their hope and their faith in us that we will do the things that we say we're committed to doing. So I'll tell you the first thing that runs through my mind is, and I'm getting old now, so I'm getting much better at leaving it in my mind and letting something else come forward. But my first thought is, I wonder if you'd like to ask Indigenous people if they're good and done with the white stuff. Because I'm going to say probably for quite some time, the Indigenous people in a territory are thinking, yeah, we're good, we got it, we get it, we know, we've heard that. That's not an option in the education system, in the structures within which you work and have to operate. And so if we can always move those boundaries a little bit, and the only way, and we all know that the only way that's going to change is through relationship. But we also have to think about how do we continue to move that work as long as we aren't backsliding. I think as long as we're still continuing to move in the right direction. Sometimes it'll be slower, and sometimes it will stop. But if we can take the opportunity to make sure when we're at those stops, that we're stopping to reflect in those pools of fear, in those pools of doubt, in those pools of trying to defend things that if we thought about it long enough, we'd understand we really shouldn't be defending. So if we can stop and reflect there, I think that then it's a stop worth taking. And if we can do that collectively, and there will be the difficult situations. There are going to be lots of difficult conversations. If we aren't having the difficult conversations, we're just actually going around the truth. And I know that, many, many times the commissioners are quoted in this work, and there are some incredibly profound quotes. This might just be a reflection on me. If it is, I'll apologize for that in advance. But one of my favorite quotes from Justice Sinclair is, "The truth will set you free, but first it's going to piss you off." And I remind people in ministries of education that if you're not pissing people off, you're not trying hard enough. And I would suggest that that applies in the work that you're doing. And not just for the sake of, obviously, but if it's not creating a little bit of energy in the discussions, and if it isn't creating some discomfort, then we're not really having the conversations, and we should probably save our time and move on to something that is making a difference. So I would like to take a little stop here for 2 or 3 minutes, and I want to ask you to talk with the people at your table, and it's going to be 2 or 3 minutes, because honestly, we could talk about this for about 3 days. So what places, what groups, what organizations, where are you kind of finding that you're pushing up against the most resistance in this work, moving forward around the rights of Indigenous children, around Indigenous children in care, around moving forward in any of that work that you're doing, supporting youth in response to the calls of the 94 calls to action. So can I ask you to do that at your tables for about 2 or 3 minutes? And Jess, I am going to be asking you, so it would be great if you could think about somebody to report back for about 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute each. Shanish. Okay, I'm going to give you about 30 more seconds, then I'm going to call you back. Okay. In some ways, it's really unfair to do that because it's such a short period of time. And sometimes, like if you're the advocate from Ontario, you don't care if I say you have 10 seconds left. You just keep talking. I love you. I know I can actually pick on Erwin, and it's okay. I don't know some of the other people that well, so. So Nashia has the mic, and I'm going to ask if you could share back a little bit, because as I said earlier, I'm one person with one lived experience, and I think the power of some of those ideas are in the sharing in this room. So if we have people that could share a little bit, and don't worry, we're not going to get stuck in just the pushback, we're going to move on, but if we can talk about some of that resistance and where that comes from.
Sorry, I came late to the conversation. I didn't even hear the question at first, so I started sharing, and I didn't. And they're like,
Honest
"That's good,
truth.
to share that." And I said, "Well, what was the question?" So we're beginning to talk about how we are our own barrier, and then I just shared an example of a quote. I can't even remember where I heard it the other day, of privilege that really stuck with me. It's been my mantra for the last little while. That privilege is, in our own barrier, might be that if, how did I put it? Oh, yeah, that when you take the opportunity to pause in working towards a cause or what have you, because you're tired, or because you're frustrated, or because you're on holidays, whatever the case may be, that's the very example of privilege, because you're not living in it. And those who are living in it don't have that privilege to do that. Okay. So we are our own barrier.
Thank you. And that's an excellent and insightful thought for all of us. You just remind me of a blanket exercise that happened with Alberta School Councils. So it's the parent councils. And one of the facilitators came to me afterwards and said, "Oh, I just got hit again when I thought," she said, "I've done the blanket exercise. I've really been trying to educate myself." She said the facilitators in the blanket exercise in this group, there were Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the group together. And the facilitator at the end said, "Take a deep breath and release the role that you were in." And a young Indigenous mother just looked at her and said, "I wish I could release the role that I'm in. It's my life every day." So Shnish for that. Who else is going to share? Great, thank you. Before we start inviting you by table.
Thanks. I'm just gonna stay seated if that's okay with folks. We kind of decided we needed a lot more time to unpackage that big question, but we talked about just I think the intellectual knowing of Indigenous perhaps philosophy or a different way of being, and how difficult it is putting that into action. And so there's pushback, and how do I do this? How do we move forward? So we talked about that, because our whole system it's a Western, right? And so everything is built on that. Even the work that we do, we're built on a Western structure. And so it permeates everything, really. So we didn't even get to the practical stuff, like when you're pushing for access to family or culture, and the practical barriers that might be in place as well. So that was what we talked about.
Thank you. Who else is ready?
We talked a lot about just underlying where we see pushback, or where we see room for development, is the attitudes with a lot of caseworkers, or just not the recognizing the impact of their actions doing their jobs. So I mean, we're just thinking about social workers specifically on the front lines, child protection, and about just reminding them about being cognizant of that experience potentially having a lifelong impact on these families, on these children, and being sensitive around those things. And then the attitudes around, as we talked about earlier, when you're dealing with people who are angry and have hurt and trauma, and recognizing that's rooted in history that we need to recognize.
Thank you. Oh, up here? find it hopeful that some of the first thoughts that people are coming up with is internal, because those are some of the things that we can change, even though it may seem sometimes like it's not.
At the table, it was said that resistance, politically incorrect to be resistant. Also, Indigenous youth who may be deaf, or there are deaf Indigenous youth, they are left out and they are not included in a lot of this discussion. There's a side where they already know too much or not understanding, slow process and dragging feet. So that's what we have.
Great, thank you. One more group. Or two.
Hi, we talked a little bit about the pushback in terms of resistance, but for us in Newfoundland and Labrador, we can't forget that our Indigenous people weren't included as part of the Truth and Reconciliation process. So there's still many who haven't been heard. However, I think that we have the opportunity now to take the learnings from the 94 recommendations, because our Innu people with the Innu Nation and our two band councils from Netwashish and Chashi, the Liberal government has agreed to an inquiry into the services. And I'm hopeful and I'm very mindful of how that's going to be. And I think that we, as a collective, have to watch very carefully that inquiry and how that's operationalized, because I think it gives our people the opportunity to talk about their experiences. I'm not Aboriginal. I don't mean to speak for them, but as you know, part of our office, we will be watching. We will be taking, I believe, an active part in that inquiry. So it's time for us to push back, maybe.
And of course, then the recent settlement agreement, right, in Newfoundland and Labrador. Yes, Shanice, Laura.
First of all, 2 to 3 minutes is like a hiccup for a conversation.
I know.
So
It's so that you have something to talk about at lunch.
yes, so the hiccup that I didn't get to express, but I'll express now, is one of the things we also have to battle is emotion.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things for Indigenous people is that we have become, our bodies have become so politicized, so that when we talk and when we try to bring issues forward, when we're emotional, it becomes political, or we're just, you know, we can't manage it. But the reality is that in the conversations is that we have to, I think this is where we can be leaders, is that we cannot have these conversations without emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we shouldn't be, our own privilege is that when people need to cry, when they need to show the expression of emotion, that we have to create spaces where it's okay. And I think it means we have to get comfortable in advocacy around emotion. I think people who do individual rights advocacy get used to it. But sometimes it isn't about an issue. Sometimes the emotion is just the very thing that the TRC talked about, not knowing and hearing for the first time and then trying to understand what it means for you. And so you can't really label the emotion, but I think we have to get better at creating spaces for emotion to be part of the conversations, because that's part of the barriers that we face. People don't talk because their emotions will overwhelm them.
Yeah, thank you, Shanice, Laura. And I think then that kind of circles back around to, you know, what Sykes shared about that hug, that kindness, that not that saving, but just that I'm there with you. And creating that safe space is also really important. So, Shanice. So, we will, and I hope that the conversations, that we actually have a couple more things that we're going to discuss at your table, but the work and the discussions don't ever end. One of the things I do want us to remember is sometimes those most shocking, sometimes they're shocking, sometimes they're, you know, very difficult to hear. The comment, some of the pushback or the resistance that we get that's really blatant and kind of takes us off guard. I just want to remind us that those are actually gifts to us. Because whether or not we hear it, it's there. And for the most part, especially as the society more broadly starts to open, the minds are opening up more. There is that groundswell of people that are becoming more engaged just by virtue of the fact that they actually have access to the truth and that education now. So a lot of the resistance and the attitudes that are less than reconciliatory are kind of underground. And so I always take those comments and some of those realities as a reminder, as a gift to remind us that we can never let up, that we are not anywhere close to being able to coast, and that we have to be very purposeful in the conversations and in setting up that environment and maintaining that environment and continuing to move that forward. So when we think about where do we best place our time and human resources, is there anybody here that has such a huge team in your office and in your region that you got it covered? Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. I just thought I would double check. The reality is that there will never be enough time. There will never be enough human resources. We don't have enough people. And collaboration is going to be our greatest tool. And what is collaboration other than relationship? If collaboration done well is relationship. And I've come to believe that that is, in some ways, the hardest reconciliation, or it certainly appears to be the most difficult reconciliation that I see happening or not happening, is organizations being able to come together to each recognize what is my part and what is not my part, and to be okay with that, and that it's not about, it would be a great problem for us to have that there was not enough work to be done and too many people to do the work. And I hope we see that someday. We're not there. So what is the collaboration? What is that outreach? What are the connections that we can make? What can we do? Who can do some of that work for us and with us if we are working and investing the time with them first? And so I think about in BC, and this is just from my limited experience in BC, I see the BC Teachers Federation has been a real ally in the work with the TRC, in the work that I'm doing in education, and I think would be, a huge ally because there's the access, and you've got the people that you can educate there and bring on as part of your team. Here in Alberta, we have the regional, I always get this one wrong, RCSD, I get the letters in the wrong order, the Regional Collaborative Service Delivery Team. So you have managers that come from education, health, and children's services. So, you get child advocate's office and staff in there. And then between the four of you can pull in justice, because that's obviously a piece that's missing there in that collaboration. But I decided, good thing Corey stopped by to say hi this morning, because I then had 30 seconds to say to him, oh, by the way, Corey, I'm going to be calling upon you this morning. Hope that's all right. So Corey comes from an education background, which some of you may or may not know. Before he was the Child and Youth Advocate in Saskatchewan, we worked together in education. And within the work in Secret Path and the Downey Wenjack Fund, Corey and I, he was one of the people on our national team. And so yesterday, when we had a little sit down about this afternoon, we also talked about what's happening there. So I feel like it would be great to hear that from Corey. But Corey, can you just... Thanks. Thanks, Nashia, the runner. Oh, he's not trying to dodge her. He's trying to help Nashia find the mic.
Thanks, Charlene.
Thanks, Corey.
Yeah, the last time we shared a podium was in Whistler, so Whistler, Banff, maybe Jasper next time. All of these beautiful places that we get to look at the mountains while we're speaking. Thank you for your speech and for what you're talking about and for challenging us. And thank you, Marie, as well, Amazing words. Your story will never get old. Keep telling it till the day you die. Everybody needs to hear it, and everybody needs to hear it more than once. So I really appreciate that. And thanks for asking me to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Saskatchewan. You know, there's a challenge, you know. When I first got the job, I was the first First Nations person in Saskatchewan to ever hold the role of advocate for children and youth in the province. And with that, you know, came a lot of responsibility, not just to the general public and to the government, but our First Nations. You know, one of the questions and one of the assumptions, one of the expectations is that, you know, Corey, you're going to save our children and you're going to bring them all home to us, right? We have almost 9,000 children in care in Saskatchewan. You know, great expectations. So how do we do that, you know, and what lens do we look at that through? You know, you look at those 9,000 children, almost 90% of them are Indigenous. You look at our corrections facilities. I visited all of them, our youth corrections facilities. I'd say 99%, almost 100% of the kids in there are Indigenous kids, either First Nation or Métis. The challenges in our education system are focused around our Indigenous children and our health systems, you know, all systems that our office has legislation over in Saskatchewan. So what do? You know, you have these great expectations, you have this amazing role, you have this platform given to you that you need to make a difference in children's lives. So, you know, we actually, over the last 10 months that I've been in the role, we took a look at our vision, we took a look at our strategic plan, and we've actually changed quite a few things. You know, one of our vision statements that we put in is focused directly around reconciliation. You know, so one of our value statements is we embrace reconciliation in our office. And that's what we do. Our fundamental goal at the end of the day is to be part of solutions that result in positive change in the quality of life for First Nation and Métis children and youth. You know, now, people say to me, well, why are you only talking about First Nation, Métis children and youth, right? That's a pushback that I get, you know, because I don't have 10 other goals here. I have one goal, right? That's our goal. And what does that goal look like? You know, that looks like many different things. That looks like children coming home from foster care systems, right? That means reducing the number of kids dying in care of government. That means reducing the number of kids being critically injured in government. So then what do? How do you accomplish that? So we changed our vision. You know, it's focused around education. It's focused around mental health. It's focused around engaging youth and giving youth back their voice. But the number one point in our vision moving forward is renewing, rebuilding, reinvigorating our relationships with our First Nations people and our Métis peoples in Saskatchewan. That's the number one thing that I've challenged our office to do, and it's right in our strategic plan. That's the number one point in our vision. So then how do you do that? How do you accomplish that? There's so many things that we're doing that we focus on that vision and that goal, but the one thing that Charlene wanted me to talk about today was about the secret path. When I started this work with the secret path, I was in education. I knew I was coming into this role. So, you know, education, there's a clear path with the secret path and with the work that Gord and the foundation do. You know, you create a resource, you get it into schools, and you get it into teachers, and then they, you know, you get it into curriculum and they start teaching it. But when I stepped into this role, there wasn't a clear path in how I could share that gift that I'd been given. You know, the gift of you know, Gord's story, and the gift of Channy's story, and the gift of being a part of something, you know, that has spanned over 50 years and is now coming out. So, you know, I thought, well, how do we do that? How do I have that impact in our office? So one of the things that I have a vision for is I want every social worker in our province to have a copy of that book, The Secret Path. I don't want them just to have a copy. I want them to have professional development in that. I want them to watch the video. I want them to watch the panel. And then I want to share my story with them. And that's not just for every social worker. That's for every youth care worker. That's for every foster parent in Saskatchewan that we have that vision for coming from our office. Now you think, well, gee, that's a pretty big vision there, Corey. How are you going to do that? You know, and the first conversation that I had around this was with the president of the Foster Families or the executive director of the Foster Families Association in Saskatchewan. So we talked about a whole bunch of things, and I said I wanted to give them professional development in this book. And so she's out there right now looking for a corporate sponsor so that she can buy books for every every foster parent in Saskatchewan. Now, something more recent that's happened. We've met, like you all do, we meet with the Ministry of Social Services, we meet with the Ministry of Education, Justice, Corrections, and Health. You probably don't all have that same mandate, but that's who we meet with. But just, I think it was last week even, we met with the Ministry of Social Services. And we offered, because they have challenges, just like we talked about. There's recordings of social workers talking racistly, derogatorily about our children and our families. So they're looking for ways to, build capacity to teach their staff about First Nation and Métis ways of knowing and knowledge. So we offered them this professional development. I said, in our office, I said, we'll do this. We'll do this for you. So I said, I'll give you 30 bucks. I'll teach your executive committee, and we'll take a half a day, and we're going to be doing that with the Ministry of Social Services. So that's Deputy Minister's office, all of their executive directors and their directors, their leadership team. So I took that out of my own budget. So from there we went, well, how do we get this, and how do we get this to all of your staff? So we've got the commitment from them that we're going to start with their frontline workers, frontline social workers, which is about 500. So once we get the books, and once we find the time, we're actually going to be giving those 500 frontline social workers, community workers, whatever they are, they're going to be getting the books, they're going to be watching the video, they're going to be watching the panel, and then I'm going to have a discussion with them. And that's where we're starting. So we're starting with those 30, then we're starting with those 500, and I fully expect this to go to their 4,000 staff, which is the ultimate goal. And then from there, we're going to go into hopefully the other areas. So that's how you can do it in your office, right? It's not just this big vision that, how do we do it? And it's not possible. It's, yes, it is possible. You just have to do it. You have to embrace it. And you have to, put it out there. And people will come and people will resist. But there are people that want to hear, that see the value in it. So I think that's where I'll stop. I think that was more than my 30 seconds.
No, that's okay. That's great.
So thank you, Charlene.
Thank you, Corey. I just think it's important to hear from different people. I think that a lot of you know what's happening with Feathers of Hope. It was good to have that conversation with Corey. And I know that there are things that are happening in all of your regions. But I think it's really great to hear ideas from other people and then think about what is that in the context of where we live. And so some of the other, when I think about where do we invest our time for advocates and training other advocates, I think about children and youth, because I think that that's so important. And there are so many reasons why that's a great way to spend our time and to put our energy. They're fearless. They're honest. They don't get bogged down in the guilt. They acknowledge truth and they immediately move themselves to action. I get asked so often by, when people are, actually usually it's, media people, they say, okay, well this is great. And then how do you move people to action? And I'll say, well, it depends how old they are. If they're kids, you don't have to. They'll move you. So things like the Feathers of Hope initiative, if you take a look at, I think Cindy Blackstock is a good friend to all of us, and the work there is all driven by children. So whether it's Jordan's principal work, whether it's Shannon's Dream Around Education, whether it's the Our Dreams Matter Too, whether it's the work around the tribunal, it's around children, and it's all children. And if you know Cindy, you know that she will not have any part of something that says no, only First Nation children or only Indigenous children. It's about all voices, all children, and the direction comes from the people of the territory. But when we think about that exclusion, if we don't call upon all children, first of all we're doing is replicating what we're living right now, because we will continue to raise children in our society and in our schools in a place that is, they'll mostly come from a place of ignorance. It might be a softer, gentler version, but it's not going to be dramatically different. There will not be the relationships. If these relationships between the children are developed while they're children, they actually have those relationships and that understanding by the time they're adults. They aren't in a place that many people in this room and many people in education systems and in many rooms across the country are seeking to build relationships because they need that relationship now to learn and to be able to move things forward. So I believe that if we really focus on the children as advocates, and so if you take a look at any of the initiatives through the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society, Cindy Blackstock's shop, I know here in Alberta, one of the areas where there's some work being done, and Del, I don't know if you're involved in that and your office is involved in that, because I just was called to a meeting around this a couple of weeks ago, but it's the Center for Global Citizenship at the University of Alberta, and they're looking at educating young people as advocates and really basing that work on the premise of moral courage and coming forward and taking your place. And so that's why I wanted Corey to also share, because I think there are different things and different initiatives and different partners, and as you start to think about what is that reconciliation that you need to do from your office with other potential collaborators, that will be probably your greatest tool. So when you think about the emotion, I was really thinking about something that happened last week. My daughter is the First Nation Métis Inuit coordinator in an elementary school in a little town north of Edmonton. The only Indigenous person on the staff at the school in an area that is very white. I'm just going to say it's very white. It's not very close to, not bordering, it's not like Sutuna to Calgary, or Enoch to Edmonton, or other nations that are close. And she came home last week and she was watching a video about children being failed by the system, and it was in Thunder Bay. And she said, "Mom, you have to watch this film. It's 33 minutes long," and I cried through the whole thing. And she said, "Mom, the government, the churches, did this. And then we have to," and I bring this up because we have to remember, our children are raised in this. They have that support, they have that knowledge, they have that background, and when they're still feeling that frustrated and tired and beat down already when they're 22, and all we can say to them is, you don't get to be tired yet because you're not old enough, and this is your life, this fight is your life, and we're here with you. She said they did it, and she said the principal of the school, and she was talking about DFC, she said in the video, the principal of the school, he's at the school and he can't sleep and he drives and he's looking for kids and their team's looking for kids. She said, when they did that and they made those mistakes and they did those terrible things, and then how come it's us that have to fix it? How come nobody else is helping us fix it? And all I could say is to remind her that when she's as old as me, she'll be a little more calm and have worked through those things, but to remind her that I could help her think about all the people that she knows and that she has the benefit of knowing because of who we are. And I've seen her comforted by Marie when she was upset before, and I've seen her, she has the people. She's, she can go to her dad and say, "Can we smudge? I'm feeling really stressed." She can get to go to the yard and have a sweat with her family, but what about all of our kids? If our kids who have that support and who are growing up in this are feeling that, then what are our other kids feeling? So I want to remind us that, and maybe I'm reminding myself, that it's a balance. And if we put all of it only on our own children by saying, no, this is only for First Nation people or community members, then A, I kind of feel like we're letting other people off the hook. B, we're not giving people the opportunity to be part of the solution. And it's going to take every one of us. So the next thing that I would like to ask you to think about in your next little hiccup of about 2 to 3 minutes is, in the work that you've been doing, and we're getting very close to lunch, so we'll be wrapping up soon. What, how, when, from whom was the most profound or the most helpful or the most enlightening time and learning that you've had in the work so far with and from Indigenous people? So is there a time, is there someone that you're working with? Has there been something that happened? I know that we have lots of challenges, but there are also those moments. I'm sure you get asked the same question that I do. How do you do this all the time? How do you do this work all the time? My first question is, how do I do what? When I think about what children are living through and what families are living through and what communities are living through, it doesn't even come close. But there are those moments and those times and those learnings and those supports, I think, that happen that are the very things that make this it's the things that energize, it's the things that continue to move us forwards, it's the things that continue to give us strength and remind us that this is doable. That if we give up, there's the outcome, that's the only outcome we know for sure. And that is not an option. So I'd like to ask you to talk about places, times, learnings, individuals. What has been something really powerful or profound that you can remember and think about and connect back to when you're coming up against some of those really difficult resistance times? 2 or 3 minutes? Okay, another minute to wrap up, and then I'm going to ask a few groups to share what they've discussed.
She tells jokes. They're not funny, but they're, it's the way she tells them. But your stories are good. Okay.
All right, Nashia, do you have the mic ready? Who would like to share? Great, thank you. Oh,
Good
we'll just
morning.
wait till everybody's ready to listen. Can you tell I used to be an elementary teacher?
Good morning. Our
Good morning.
table is primarily from the rep's office in BC, and what we were speaking about was the importance of youth engagement. And very similar to Feathers of Hope in BC, we have held 2 forums for youth in care called Igniting Your Spirit. And the highlight for people was the opportunity to hear, the opportunity to support youth leadership, but to be a witness to a process and to be relational with kids. The other work that we talked about as far as the importance of the work that we're doing as advocates is to have those opportunities to leave your office, to get off your computers, to get off your phone, and to really connect and to understand lived experience.
Shneesh.
In a nutshell.
Thank you,
Thank
Shneesh
you.
Pinamat. Who else has something they'd like to share? Your lunch is waiting.
We talked about in our office how some of us traveled across the province, meeting with Indigenous groups and elders and young people when we worked on our special report, and that although there were often sad stories, there's also a lot of hopeful stories. So that's a motivator as well for the good work. And I also talked about our colleagues we have in the office, like Kobe and Walter and Amanda. So if we need a pick-me-up, you know, Kobe's got, we said it, and she agrees, she has bad jokes, but it's the way she tells the story, so that helps us. And we also talked about how there was a 10 or 11-year-old girl. She met with the Minister of Education, this would have been Ontario, to advocate for her school because it was being closed and she was an Indigenous young person. And she stood up to the minister and said her piece, and then the school stayed open. So there was a positive story.
Yeah, Shneesh. Thank you. I think sometimes when we talk about knowledge keepers, what we forget is that the young people are the knowledge keepers of their own stories and their own lived experience as well. Shneesh.
So I think the story is learning that we don't have all the answers. We are doing a little project called This Is What Reconciliation Looks Like, and it's going to be probably a year long, and next year we'll do something in our annual report about it. So we have this little advisory group of 11 and 12-year-olds, and we took them around the community, took a picture of them by the river, we take them to meetings with leaders, we take a picture by a sacred fire. I got a picture of them looking in the windows of the cultural center, kind of like, where's my culture kind of thing. They're all Indigenous. And there's a lot of art going on right now in our community, like Indigenous art, like all across the outsides of big buildings. And there's a special piece that you may have seen in the media on a murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And the one major unsolved murder, Angel Carlick's pictures on there with her mom, who was now murdered this year as well. And we've got pictures of the kids there. And then this 11-year-old Indigenous girl says to me, why were they murdered? And I just need to end it there. I don't know.
Yeah. Exactly. Sykes, do you want to speak?
I hope you don't expect me to give you all the answers. But I live in 2 worlds. I've been able to adapt to those 2 worlds. And one of the biggest challenges in working with children, the youth, is I have to put aside my academic profession and just being a human being, to be able to communicate with them. It's not an immediate process. Rome was not built overnight. It's sitting down with those kids and just be a human being. Forget about your professionalism. Because you're all in this room who come from a hierarchical system. And your processes are different at different levels. Those are the things that I talk about. I have to put aside. Because I've been involved in almost in every professional, skills academically. I've been involved in so much of the law, including the leading negotiator on the Constitution for the 600 chiefs. So I hear so much about the elders that they say, put your white man thinking away and think like us. So that's what I'm talking about. When I meet children, I have to put my professional skills, professional training aside, and just be who I am and listen to them. Sometimes there's nothing seems to come out of that first contact because their trust has been broken. So it's that rebuilding of the trust is very, very important. And this is where we have to bring ourselves down to their level to be able to communicate with them. And that's one of my biggest challenges. And as I said, I'm still learning at 84 because the children today, our children, are thinking differently because they're so indoctrinated in a confused world of two worlds, in a confused situation of two worlds. We tell them, get to know your language, get to know your culture. At the same time, we say, no, get some education, get some education. They're confused. And this is why we have, across Canada, we have one of the highest dropout rates of our Indigenous students. But I just wanted to share that because I'm very capable. I feel that I'm capable of competing in the dominant society's academic world as well, professionally. But I have to put those aside. There will be a time when I can use it, but not now. I have to get down, sit down with a child, give them a hug. That's the first process in building a relationship, is to let them know that you love them. Because this is what we missed at residential school. We don't know what body contact means. It's giving them that assurance and communication. Many times just that body language means a lot more to kids than talking to them. So I just wanted to share that. Sometimes getting that relationship started will take a number of visits, but give them time. That's just why I said give them as much time as they want. Once they start talking to you is when you're connecting and you will begin to understand where they're coming from so that you can help them.
And I think those teachings about being a human being and how we connect with one another are really important values and processes and practices that we could take into our places of work and how we treat each other and how we work with one another and how we work with those people that may become, do some collaboration with us. And I really appreciate your comment around that hierarchical structure and how we talk about top down. And isn't it interesting, if you think about the game that, I think some call it Jenga, the game that kids play where you pull the pieces, there's 3 pieces of wood. Do you ever notice that you can take it apart from the top all day long, nobody notices, nothing happens? And that foundation, which some people refer to as the bottom, there's not even there's no impact. But if you take out the foundation, what some people consider as the bottom, or pieces within that, it's it won't last any amount of time. And so I think that we can apply that, just be a human being. If we could apply that to everything that we do, we might make some progress. Shanice, Norm?
I just want to share this thought that came to me when Marie Wilson was talking this morning, and all the advocates were at the closing ceremonies. And when Dell read the declaration, Irwin spoke after. And I'll paraphrase him. And he said, look, he quoted this, I think, from the author Thomas King, The Inconvenient Indian, that book. And he said, look, you can do what you want with the story. You can make a movie, you can write a book, you can write a play, you can do an essay. But what you can't do is that you can never say that you never heard the story. And this is what we have to take back to our governments. You've heard the story. Don't give me this business about you don't know. If you choose not to do anything, that's your choice. But you've heard the story. And that struck me, and it stuck with me for 2 years. And I carry that in my thought process when I'm dealing with people, especially government departments. And I think we have to remember that. That is the story. It's the truth of it.
Shanice. And I think in closing, one of the things that is our reality is that we will define ourselves as a country, as individuals, within our places of work. We will define ourselves by the way we respond to and take responsibility for and take action around that truth and around that story. So as we started, I would like to invite you to find your own place. Find your place in the 94 calls to action. Find your place within your team. Think about what it is that you have to offer. What are your connections? What is your knowledge? What is your lived experience? What is your part? Find your place within the context of the Indigenous people in the land where you live. Take up that part and raise up and lift up and honor those young people and the voices of the children that you advocate on behalf of, and walk this path with them and learn from each other. And most importantly, I would like to thank you so much for your time. I recognize that we don't have the open learning space because we have filled it. But I would invite you to think about and have discussions over lunch, not only about what you heard this morning and how those pieces come together, but also what you heard from the youth yesterday and what you've heard from one another. And thank you so much on behalf of my grandchildren and children and extended family and the children that you serve with such a good heart and that you support. So with that, Ishnish Pinamat.